Make sure you follow me on social media to get updates and ask me questions. Enjoy the video. So I will start by using events and listeners in this video. So I have already migrated the tables, as you can see here, and I also want to set up the default Laravel authentication. So we can very easily do this. PHP artisan make auth. So this will create everything, the controller, the views, the routes. So if I refresh, we should have login and register. Alright, so let's try and register for the first time. So I will register, and once we click register, we should be authenticated and have this dashboard. However, let's have a moment to think about the steps you would normally do for when a user registers. So if you have watched my advanced authentication in Laravel course, then you know that after we register a user, we send an activation email and we assign a role to that user. Of course, we are not going to implement that logic again here from the beginning. However, I want you to open the register controller. Let me take this down. Okay. As you already know, this is the controller that registers a user using the default authentication that Laravel provides. I will show you two different ways of implementing some extra logic in this create function. The first way will be without using events and listeners, and the other way will be using events and listeners. So first, let's start without. I will modify a bit the create function. I will store the user in a user variable, and I want to return the user. Of course, the logic is still the same, nothing has changed. However, as I said, I want to send an email after we create the user and then assign a role to that user. So normally you would have the activation and assign role code inside the function, inside the create function, like this. Activation code here and then the role code. So this is what you would normally do, but this is a mistake. The create function will have a lot of logic and you do not want that. So instead, what you can do is to create a function for each action. So in this case, we would have a protected function send activation code, and this of course accepts a user, and you would also have another one for the assign role. So assign role to user, and let's also say here send activation code to user. So each of these functions will now have its own logic, right? So this is the logic to send an activation code, and this is where the logic will be to assign a role to that user. Now, I don't want to have any kind of logic for now. I want to keep things simple. So let's simply log info, and I want to say here activation, and then we want to log the user. I will copy this and paste it here for the role. Of course, now we have to call the functions inside create. So what we can do is to say here this send activation code to user, and we also pass the user, and again this assign role to user. Or what you can do is to chain the methods. So simply return this here and also this here. And after you do that, you can simply do it like this in one line. Okay, so now if we try to register in the log file, in the Laravel log file, which I do not have because I do not have logged anything, but once we register, we should have the log file ready, the Laravel log file, and we will see the activation and role logged. So let's log out and register again. So this will be Renato2, again the same, secret and secret. So now we are again registered, and if I go to the Laravel log file, as you can see, we have logged activation and role, which is pretty much what we actually did here. So we are calling the send activation code to and the assign role to functions, and each of these functions will log something. Now, this is a valid way to do this, okay? There is nothing wrong with this, and the code is very readable, because what we do here is to simply create the user, and then we call two functions. And because we are chaining the functions using return this, in both of them, we can very easily have all this in just one line. Or if you want this to be more readable, you can have this in 2 lines, 3 actually. So if someone else will see the code, they know exactly what the code does, because simply we create a user, then we send an activation code to the user and assign a role to the user. Just that. So this is fine. However, we can implement this using events and listeners. Now let me tell you something. Whenever you have the option to use object-oriented programming, then do it. This code, as I said, is valid. It is readable, it is easy to maintain. However, it can get even easier. So if you can convert a function, like we have here, into a class, then do it. So in our case here, we have 2 functions, and I want each of these 2 functions to be its own class. Also, I want this line of code that we have here to be a separate class as well. I know you might be thinking, why should we do this? And my answer is, why would you put send activation and assign role functions inside the register controller when you can separate the logic and have each function working on its own without depending on this class? Because for now, we do not have any kind of logic, right? But if we have logic for send activation and assign role, this class will be very, very big. For now, it is almost 100 lines. Imagine if we have some logic here, it will be even bigger than that. So again, it is fine to have protected and private functions inside the controller. However, if you have the option to limit the controller to do just the job it is supposed to do, then make sure you do it. In this case, this is a REST controller, and why don't we let it to be just a REST controller? So let me introduce you to events and listeners. So whenever you work with events, you should ask yourself, what happened in this function? A user was registered. Forget about this code here. This is code that we added, okay? And we will delete in the end. So the only thing that you have to worry about is this line right here. So a user was registered. So this is the name of our event, user registered. So open the event service provider. You already have some dummy code here. So once again, the event is called user registered, because this is what we said we do here. We register a user. So after the user is registered, which is what happens here, we are taking some actions. So after the user was registered, what we want to do is to send an activation code and assign a role. And these are our listeners. So you see the pattern here? It is pretty much the logic that we have just implemented. So when the user registered event is fired, then it will call 2 listeners. One will be called send activation code, and the other one assign role. And this is exactly what we do inside here. This is the send activation code listener, and this is the assign role listener. And this here is the code which pretty much does the work of the user registered event. So all these are classes. Of course, we do not have them available yet, and in order to create them, you have to run php artisan event generate. Now, if you go to app and you take a look at events and listeners folders, you will see them there. So I will start with the event. I will clear this class a bit because this is not necessary. Okay, so in the code that we have implemented here, what do we do? Because remember, these lines stimulate the user registered event that we have right here. So these lines, they simply call the 2 functions and pass the user to each function. So in the event service provider, we have already specified which listeners are related to this event. So all we have to do inside the event is to initialize the user in order to pass the user to the listeners. Let me start by creating a public variable, user. And because this event is responsible to initialize and pass the user to the listeners, we need to access the user model. So, access the user and make sure you also import the user model. Alright, now we simply say this user equals to the user that we pass. And this is all that we have to do inside the event. Now let's open the send activation code listener. As you can see, this listener is already associated to the user registered event. Because of this, we can access the user that we initialize inside the user registered event. So what I'm going to do is to copy this log, and I will go down to this one, inside there, and I will say event, and then user. So we are accessing this user right here. So this is what we do here. And of course, this is where you have your logic to send an activation email to this user. Now, I will do the same for the assign role listener. So I will come down here and paste that, change it to role, and we are fine. So the last step is to finally fire the user registered event. So how can we fire an event? To fire an event, you simply call the event function, then you say new user registered, which is the event, and you pass the user. So now I will remove all this code because none of this is required. So once again, we fire the user registered event, right? And this event requires a user. And this is what we do here. We pass the created user. So this now event will initialize this user in order for the listeners send activation code and assign role to have access to the user. And of course, these listeners are related to this event because this is where we specify it. Inside the event service provider, we say that the user registered event is associated with send activation code and assign role listeners. Alright guys, so let me now clear the console, the log file, and I will try to register again for the last time. So let's see if this works. We log out, register, and this is my third try. Okay. So if I go back to this now, Laravel log file, and you can see activation and role are again logged. So this was the video regarding events and listeners in Laravel. This is how you fire an event, this is what you have to do inside an event, and this is where you pretty much have the logic for the listener.